Welcome back to Analysis, where we've been looking at the resignation of the Egyptian government and asking the question whether the replacement team will make any difference to the recent course of events in a country that is still being rocked by the aftermath of the coup that got rid of President Mohamed Morsi last year. David, do you think that the new government will make any difference to the kind of situation with civil liberties at the moment? Because as one of our guests said earlier, there's a very large number of people in jail, not just people from the Brotherhood, but a number of activists who were absolutely key to the the anti-Mubarak revolution that started it all. A number of journalists, including famously the Al Jazeera people. Is that likely to change under this government?
I was reading some old Human Rights Watch reports on Egypt on the way up here. Egypt's chapter from this year's, last year's, the year before's World Report from Human Rights Watch. And the thing you notice is how consistent the human rights abuses are. Under Mubarak, under the generals, under Morsi, and then under the coup government. Now, obviously, what's happened since the coup has been particularly bad. I mean, we've had massacres of a level that have never been seen before, mass arrests of political prisoners by the thousands. So something particularly bad has gone on since then. But we have to be clear that these abuses have just been going on the whole time. And from my point of view, as someone whose expertise is in British foreign policy, and perhaps your viewers at home from their point of view as well, we have to think about what our stake is in this, because throughout all this, the British state has been arming the Egyptian military. I mean, some licences were revoked, about 5 licences were revoked for arms exports last July. But generally, the supplies have just gone on. It's just been business as usual, which is what Britain always does when regimes like this behave in this way. So something for us to think about in Britain. There's a constant level of human rights abuses. It's particularly bad now. And we need to stop helping the human rights abusers by selling them arms.
Shazi, is this the picture that David paints? Is this because the deep state, as Tamir referred to it, has remained significantly untouched by the whole process of revolution?
I think so. I mean, I think one thing that we've seen has been that this kind of move towards democracy, towards social justice and these kinds of things, it's been much slower. The 2011 revolution wasn't suddenly an upheaval of all these things and a new change and a new chapter. It was just, unfortunately, a continuation of much of the same, because we were talking about decades and decades of human rights abuses where it had become so ingrained in the state that actually this was just kind of, normal day-to-day activity. It was inevitable that it was going to take some time, but the fact that Egypt's been so unstable over the course of the few years since the 2011 revolution hasn't given anyone the opportunity to really correct and start to look at how to develop human rights and how to develop a strong democracy.
I mean, Tamir, the truth is that there isn't going to be any form of democracy in Egypt without a much more significant challenge to the deep state, is there?
No, I think that's correct. I think, unfortunately, right now for us in Egypt is in the face of insecurity, and a lot of security issues are going on in Egypt right now. For some, as happens in everywhere else in the world, your civil liberties and human rights end up taking kind of the background in essence. And I think what's going to be a huge challenge for this cabinet, the government to come, be it under Sisi or whomever it is if the grip on civil liberties and human rights is not released and you don't genuinely move forward with some form of democratic process. I think, the bells of social justice and dignity that raised millions of Egyptians on January 25th will come back again. And I think, in essence, what needs to happen is, that grip must, be released a little bit more. Will the current cabinet change any of the human rights issues that we've been seeing over the last 6, 7, 8 months? I don't think so. I think so long as the Egyptians feel that they're under continued attack and or terrorism, whatever way they're painted and how genuine they are, I think we will still continue to see these issues. And unfortunately, a lot of the public will continue turning the other way and just let it happen.
Dr. Dardari, is it, do you think, the paradox in the situation that in order to have the kind of democratic change that many Egyptians thought would be the result of the original revolution, there almost has to be a second revolution now, but at a time when many Egyptians have been exhausted by the process?
Yes, there is a lot of pressure on the Egyptian people, but as you said it clearly, that there is a need for another revolution now. We call it first revolution, a counter-revolution, and the third revolution that is coming. And it is very much the same reasons that led to the first revolution are still there. There is no economic progress, there is no freedom, there is no social justice, and there is no human dignity. And you cannot imagine the sufferings that Egyptians are going through on a daily basis. An Egyptian, it is really up to the Egyptian people and their friends, the friends of democracy, human rights, and rule of law now, where they stand. Do they stand with the highest form of terrorism, which was committed by the military? Terrorism is the use of violence for political ends. It was Sisi who used the violence, and the military and the government that came after used violence to get rid of the president, get rid of elected officials. That is the crime that needs to be talked about. Unless this issue is addressed fairly and squarely, I don't see a political process or a political exit of the existing crisis right now. And that's the challenge that Egyptians on a daily basis are saying there is no way this coup will recognize or the coup government will be recognized. And really Europe, the United States of America, they really need to decide where they stand. Do they support the coup or they support freedom, rule of law, and democracy in Egypt? If they support it, they need to stand by the peaceful demonstrators who are in the streets of Egypt on a daily basis. That's an ethical question. And history will tell who supported democracy, who supported the coup. These are not going to be secrets in 5 years, 10 years from now. So it is really a call on all of us now to decide which direction we would like to take. Support the coup and it is terrorism, or support the people who are trying their best to bring back democracy and bring back the rule of law and bring back human rights. And sorry to end with this, it is not fair to put Sisi, the coup government, and Morsi's government in one sentence about human rights abuses. During Morsi, the record was way, way better than the previous and the ones after. There was not one single political prisoner during the first year of Morsi's government. Of course, we had problems with the police. The police needs to be restructured, need to be reformed. And these problems, you cannot solve them in 1 year, 2 years, or even 5 years. You need really a lot of time to be able to reform the police. There is a culture of hegemony. There is a culture of dictatorship that is going on in Egypt for decades now, from the time of the British colonialism until the time of the military dictatorship. And this is the time now Egyptians have to be able to say no to both practices of colonialism and also practices of the military dictatorship.
David, I mean, you were talking about British foreign policy, and inevitably, you know, we hear the language of the kind of war on terror. But there's a kind of irony in the situation at the moment. This language emerged out of the Bush and Blair years to justify the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, but now that language is being taken up by the government in Egypt, by Assad in Syria, and played back to the West, you know, saying, well, you know, you were against terrorism, now we're against terrorism, why aren't you supporting us? I mean, there's a you know, the chickens are coming home to roost a bit for the foreign policy there, aren't they?
I think just after 9/11, Noam Chomsky said that every authoritarian regime in the world is now going to use this war on terror rhetoric. You're with the terrorists, and you know this kind of belligerent Manichean way of describing the conflicts they're engaged in. And it was true right from the start. Sharon was using it immediately afterwards. Putin was using it in Chechnya. And yeah, we're seeing it now most cynically with Assad and with the Sisi government as well. So yeah, it is ironic. Yeah.
Shadi, do you think that this is now going to be a turning point, not because the government is significantly different, but because some of the opposition now is coming from different quarters? Do you think it's that the popularity, the popular appeal of Sisi has peaked?
I mean, it's you know, it's hard to tell because, of course, we're still, you know, looking at this from the outside. But I think one of the things that we can see, Dr. Dardari touched on it, is that, you know, the opposition is not just the Muslim Brotherhood. It's not just, you know, members of the Freedom and Justice Party. People have seen all kinds of people being targeted by the new regime. And actually that has caused a great deal of concern, you know, from left through to, you know, all the way through to the Freedom and Justice Party. And actually that's really interesting. And I think, you know, I think actually the detention of journalists has been one thing that has really piqued everyone's interest, because it's not something that people expected to see in Egypt under the new under this regime particularly, and the fact that there are journalists from Al Jazeera, but you know, in detention, you know, on some trumped-up charges, has brought out, you know, a real different kind of opposition and brought everyone together in a way.
Mm. I mean, tell me, I mean, the rest of the Al Jazeera journalists and charging them essentially as terrorists. That was the language. I mean, that's the kind of signal that you're dealing with a deeply undemocratic government, even compared to previous Egyptian governments.
I think the battle between, you know, what's going on with Al Jazeera and the journalists and the government and Qatar, it's unfortunately not just a question of freedom of speech and journalism, but there is kind of, you know, an ongoing, almost proxy fight of words between Qataris and the Egyptians. And you know, you have the claim that's being thrown out is that journalists did not have the proper licensing and they were operating from, you know, the Marriott Hotel with providing access to the Muslim Brotherhood, who are supposedly labeled as a terrorist group. All claims which I think are completely, you know, ridiculous to some extent. However, unfortunately, I think the outside world hasn't come to grasp that there is a cult following of Field Marshal Sisi in Egypt by a lot of majority. There is a growing opposition, but it's not the type of opposition that I think will make a dent.
The referendum wasn't a slam dunk, though, was it? By a long way.
I think.
I'm not arguing.
I think the referendum, you can cut and dice it whichever way you want. I mean, you know, I think it was a little, you know, laughable that it passed by 97% of those who showed up. I think it's unfortunate and you know, mind-boggling that, you know, the other 3%, some of them are actually going to jail for, or being challenged to go to jail for having actually advocated a no vote. But then you obviously have a huge part of the Muslim Brotherhood who represented 5-6 million who never really showed up to the streets to even partake or participate in it. So, but when you look at the numbers are actually greater and more than those that came out in 2012. So the problem
but not hugely.
Not hugely. They were 1-2 million. But I think that's taking into account that 5-6 million didn't participate. So you can dice them the way you want. I think, unfortunately, I try and avoid the numbers game in Egypt because it depends on who has access to the buses and the people to kind of roll them in to show up. But I think what we have here in Egypt right now is, you know, as you mentioned, the outside world is looking at the journalists, the Al Jazeera's journalists especially, and looking at kind of, you know, the closing in on freedom of speech, amongst other civil liberties and rights. But what seems to also be ignored is the media in Egypt, which is completely pro-Sisi and the government. And I think they played a big role in having the previous cabinet actually, you know, sink. And you know, will there be a third revolution of some sort? I don't think it's going to be anything that's going to happen too soon. I think where people will be challenged and the government will be challenged is, again, if the grasp on civil liberties does not, you know, get released or loosened a little bit more as we go along, irrespective of who becomes president in Egypt.
Dr. Dari, I mean, I think most commentators looking at it are saying, all right, there's a process of the government being unable to deal with the economic problems. There's a huge issue with civil liberties and political freedom. I think that most commentators are assuming that at some point the kind of popular support that Sisi has is going to erode, is already beginning to erode. But do you think a critical point will be reached before or after he runs for president? In fact, do you think he will run for president?
We hope that he runs for the presidency because that will mobilize the people and will know the reason why the coup took place, is the man wants to become the president. And I don't mind him becoming the president if he were to leave the military, form a party or join a party and run as a normal Egyptian, but to use the Egyptian weapons and to use the Egyptian military for him to become the president and to kill imprison thousands of Egyptians for him to become the president. That is not fair. That is not going to be accepted. I understand your sympathy with the Al Jazeera journalists, but the issue goes beyond just the Al Jazeera journalists. The issue goes about the 90 million Egyptians who do not have freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, or even freedom of movement. Look at the number of minors. Can you believe that 14-year-old kid is put in prison for 3 years because he carried that sign of Rab'a sign? Can you look at the number of women?
Dr. Dari, just let me ask you about that. What are the state now? What's the situation with the trials now that are being brought forward of Freedom and Justice Party people and others, of course?
These trials are farcical trials. They are not real trials. They're trying to accuse President Morsi of espionage with foreign governments while he was the president of the country, and accusing him was laughable stuff. They made Egypt the coup government, and unfortunately, an important section of the judiciary also participated in this. They're trying. Can you believe that they're putting students, hundreds of students, in jail because of protesting on campus? Or look at the number of women, young women put in jail for just saying no to the military peacefully, running peacefully in the street. So this is the type of country we have. It is not an issue of the Muslim Brotherhood per se or the Freedom and Justice Party. It is the issue of the people of Egypt who made the revolution, and then the forces of the old regime succeeded in creating a counter-revolution. Now it is up to the Egyptian people and up to the people who love freedom, support democracy and human rights, to support this also in Egypt. And I don't think it is going to take very long until the large number of Egyptians, now even some Egyptian liberals, are saying, yay, we made a big mistake by supporting the military. I think consciousness is coming back to a large section of the Egyptian people, and I expect something important can happen in these coming few months.
Okay, well, let's talk about that kind of timescale then. You know, Tammy said he expects it to be, if I've got him right, longer rather than shorter. I think Dr. Dari there was saying that, you know, the tide's already beginning to turn. What do you think about timing in terms of the erosion of support for Sisi? Will he make it to president before that happens?
It's pure speculation, isn't it? I think that there's a broader picture of the fact that really central issues affecting ordinary Egyptians are just not being addressed from one post-Mubarak regime to the other, in terms of people's quality of life, in terms of human rights. And as long as that's the situation, as long as that's the case, as long as there's still a need for bread freedom and social justice, then the people at the top are never going to be completely secure. I mean, you know, you can take a guess as to what the date will be when the tipping point comes for the popularity of whoever's in place at the moment. But, I mean, the real point is the broader problems which are not being addressed. No one seems to have a long-term development plan for the Egyptian economy. I can't spot one from the outside, from the Muslim Brotherhood, from the people around the coup government. It's just not discernible. And until there's something like that, we're going to, you know, Egypt's going to go around in circles. It's going to lurch from crisis to crisis.
Shazia, what's your view about this, about the kind of timescale with which you might see the kind of erosion of popularity of Sisi?
I mean, it's difficult to put a timescale on it. I think, you know, the biggest problem is that we don't really know what Sisi's intentions are at the moment. He'll certainly try, you know, from the outside it seems he certainly wants to try to run for president. That seems to still be part of the big game plan. But whether he actually achieves that, whether he goes down that road, is difficult to tell at the moment. Realistically, if he does go down that road and if he does kind of, you know, run forward and go for president, you know, we could be looking at a longer term thing. If events change, and they have changed, and no one expects events to change as quickly as they have done over the last few years in Egypt, but if events change, we could be looking at a completely different government in, you know, 6 months' time.
Tara, I mean, you were saying you thought that the timescale will be longer. So I guess you're assuming that that Sisi will run for president, that he will become president, and then it's a question of what happens beyond that.
I think when you look at it, based on the constitution in the past, you know, we should be having elections come April or May. I think the fact that nobody's really generally announced who's running, and although there's been kind of a popular following and push from the ground up and from the top down as well for Sisi to run, I don't think he's going to nominate or run or designate himself as a presidential candidate until you have some type of rules, which is why I was saying that I believe the rules are supposed to come out on Thursday. The next 2-3 weeks, I think that's when the game will really begin. If Sisi decides to run, I think he'll win. Whether he wins from the first or second round, I think will be dependent on the number of oppositions and number of votes that may end up bifurcating a lot of his own votes as well. But once he then takes over, I think what we'll see after that, obviously, is next is you have your parliamentary elections. Now, whether the issues will change and whether, the problems that are facing Egypt will change, I think part of what, a lot of us have been naive with is that there are a lot of deep issues in Egypt. It's been ongoing for 30, 60 years, whereby you have problems beginning, social issues, educational issues, economic issues. I think anyone who thought that, having Morsi come in a year would be resolved, obviously we saw that was not the case. I think a lot of the issues that resulted in ousting Morsi were self-imposed by him and his party. I think having, the new government come in under the, military and being military-backed, anyone expecting them to resolve Egypt's problems in 6-7 months, I think is just completely out of touch with the reality of what is on the ground in Egypt. So if Sisi does come, he's a very meticulous, very calculated individual. And I don't think he's one who's looking to come and then fail shortly after. And I think that's one of the reasons why the cabinet was reshuffled and removed, was in order to ensure there is some form of stability or addressing the issues that are in Egypt before he actually nominates himself.
Dr. Dari, do you think that that the crisis for Sisi will come after he's run for president?
The crisis is already there now, and it will be more after. If Sisi runs, most likely he will become the president, and most likely will be from the first round. So you see, there is a culture of corruption in Egypt. There is a culture of election corruption in Egypt. And I, as someone who was elected, who lived through Mubarak era and was elected after the revolution, I'm very much familiar with the culture of corruption. There is no democracy. The two things that Egypt needed most was transparency and accountability. And these two will not be available under a military coup. The reason why the military wanted to get rid of Morsi's government is because it failed to be held accountable, especially its budget. The military does not want to be told what to do. The military wants to run. It is, you see, in Egypt, you have a military that has a state now. And that is something, if this happened during Mubarak era, I would have expected it to continue for some time. But because this happened 3 years after the January 25th revolution, there is, in the Egyptian psyche now, there is a strong will, especially younger Egyptians. And this has nothing to do with the Muslim Brotherhood. It is the younger Egyptian they want to be able to live in a free society. Okay. They want to be able to express their own ideas. They would like the same 4 principles, the economic progress, which cannot happen under Sisi, because look at tourism now.
Okay, Dr.
It is not there.
I'm afraid I'm going to have to stop you there because that's all we've got time for. We're coming to the end of the programme. But we've followed every development in the Egyptian revolution since it began. And on Analysis, we'll continue to do that. So do rejoin us for future episodes. Thanks for watching.